Okay, we're just testing here our new system. Yep.
So that's
Good.
And then press it.
Right, we will open the meeting. We have a quorum. Right, welcome everyone. Apologies, I'll move the apologies. We have apologies from Councillor Cooper for lateness. Councillor Sayers will second. All those in favour? Okay, declaration of interest. There are none. There are no petitions, no public input, no local board input, and no extraordinary business. And we have the first item, which is. Sorry?
Did you get them to vote on the apologies?
Perhaps I didn't get you to vote on the apologies. All those in favour? Against? Right. Claire and Alistair, please. Thanks. Welcome, guys.
Sorry, I'm just getting used to new technology here. Look, we've had a couple of workshops now on this item about the potential land transfers of the waterfront land. So perhaps I'll take the report as read. In fact, just emphasise the options in front of you for consultation. I think it's just worth noting that if you decide to consult on the transfer of all of the assets, you will be able to make a decision at a later date to transfer a subset of those or none at all. If you decide to consult on only transferring some of the assets, you would only be able to transfer those assets or less. You wouldn't be able to transfer more than what you consulted on. So perhaps I'll just leave it at that by way of introduction. Happy to take questions.
So, councillors, that's essentially the nub of the issue, and I won't repeat it. We have Councillor Simpson, then Councillor Hills with questions.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about two parts to this. One is the transfer, and one is the implications of the forthcoming tax change. I'm going to start with the transfer of ownership. In paragraph 4 of the executive summary, you state the legal ownership of the properties would have likely transferred back to council when the waterfront development is complete. Could you clarify what would likely have been and what the sort of the general rules or understanding in development of this kind has been?
Thank you, through the chair. Look, I think it was always envisaged, certainly at a staff level, that there would be a transfer once the developments down Wynyard had been completed. It's fairly normal practice. There are examples in the UK and Australia where a development organisation is given an area to redevelop, and once that redevelopment is complete, that organisation either winds itself up or moves on to focus on other areas. And I think with the way Panuku operates in a number of locations around the region, I think once the job of transformation in Wynyard is done, you'll be left with public spaces to manage and some long-term leases which require no real active work, and that's more core council business and a development agency business. So logically it would make sense to transfer those assets back to council.
Thank you, and then I'd like to move on to the sort of the tax issue. Is what you are proposing illegal?
No.
Is what you are proposing sort of what most ratepayers would do who potentially have an accountant, that when they know a new law is coming in, go to the accountant and saying, is there any changes, academic changes we need to do to assist our financial situation come a law change?
Look, I'll throw this to Francis in a second because he's more the tax expert, but we as staff and you as governors have an obligation to be good stewards of public funding that we manage. Part of that is we play our tax position. We don't have a large risk appetite for doing dodgy tax deals. We play things with a very straight bat, but also being the good stewards of public funds. also encompasses good financial planning. And here is something where we can see a potential future liability if our affairs weren't put in order, and it is a significant one. So it's perfectly right and proper for us to plan for that and to ensure that we're not doing anything illegal. Staff will be working with the IRD to try to get a binding ruling before you make your final decisions on this post-consultation. Maybe, Francis, have you got anything to add?
Through you, Chair. This is exactly what mums and dads would do. If you had a situation where you could do something that would arrange your affairs so that you don't need to pay tax that you would pay later. We are, just to clarify as well and be very clear, one of the things that we don't do at council is do anything that sails close to the wind. We always, as Alistair said, play straight back. We obey the law and we work within the law always, and we don't even try and sail close to the wind. That is why we've made this, the staff have made this recommendation that it's appropriate for us to consider whether we do this transfer now. And in order to ensure belts and braces, we actually are working with our tax advisors and the IRD to seek a binding ruling on this.
And I just want to clarify, so that binding ruling will, from the IRD, will come, we will not make a decision until that binding ruling has come back to council, correct?
We expect that to be back by the time you need to make the decision. The key thing is about whether we actually transfer the assets or not. So let's deal with that when it comes, but you certainly will not want to make the decision without a binding ruling.
Thank you. And I've got a question about Westhaven, but I think Councillor Hills wants to answer that, so I'll let him do that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I guess my question is, and maybe it's more for the politicians rather than the officers, but I know the assumption is we should potentially look at full transfer for consultation so that we can work backwards if we need to afterwards. But I worry that if our intent isn't clear, that we don't want to transfer everything, say we want to leave the working waterfront with Panuku. Is there any way we can consult on both options, or you just can't do that? You have to be clear about your intention. Because it's sort of, my concern is that we consult on the full, but that shows the public that that's what we want, when potentially if we're interested to leave the working waterfront with Panuku, and based on consultation or not, we do that. And I understand that if we only consult on partial, we have no opportunity to transfer the full. So I guess it limits our options. But I'm just worried about our intent around the table.
Through the chair, I'll just comment that the consultation document that has been prepared on the full transfer of assets does include as one of the options that has been considered is a partial transfer of the assets, leaving the working waterfront assets in Panuku ownership. And I think it even expresses that the Panuku board has, or Panuku has expressed support for that option, whilst admittedly still saying that the full transfer is the preferred option in that consultation document. But I think that really is a matter more for you and your colleagues around the table than us as staff.
An important distinction there is that this is a consultation issue, and that's really the assumption is we're saying it's a good thing to go out and consult about it. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to do it. And indeed, perhaps the sentiment around is that we won't be doing it, but this is to go out and consult, otherwise you can't do it.
Thank you. Just following that line then, how does consulting on one option satisfy Local Government Act requirements to undertake an options analysis and present that options analysis? I can see that we've workshopped the options analysis, but it's not transparent to our communities that we have. And I'm also interested in the line that Councillor Hills is following. Is I'm struggling to see why we don't at least consult on the full or partial transfer of waterfront assets. I can understand why you wouldn't consult on the status quo, because that has immediate significant tax implications. But you could still, why would you not even consult on that and outline those implications to communities and consult on full and partial and outline the benefits and disbenefits of those two options as well? So that's my first question.
Through the chair, the options analysis in the consultation document for the full transfer looks at the options of the full transfer, leaving all of the assets in Panuku ownership, so the status quo, as well as transferring the completed development properties and the completed and the future development properties. So there's 4 separate options with advantages and disadvantages listed in the consultation document. So all of those things are there, but it just states that the preferred option is the full transfer. So there is detail given about all those options in the document.
Why doesn't the motion reflect the body of the work then? I just I'm not understanding why is your recommendation not consistent with the body of work you've undertaken? I don't get it. See the B, but the A is critical because that's the direction setter.
I think that the technical point here is you must have a proposal to go out and consult on. And the consultation documents, the 2 options, one, the proposal is the full transfer of assets. So that is what is being consulted on. And the other detail that's in the document to support that is other alternative options that were considered. So that's one of the consultation documents. We've also worked to prepare another consultation document where the proposal that is being consulted on is the transfer of the development properties only. And again, it includes the other possible options, but the recommended option or the preferred option in that case is just the transfer of the development properties.
So if I went back and looked at other proposals we put to communities, we would have led clearly with a single option. We would have led out with a single option, and we wouldn't have referred to other options in the motion, which is your recommendation.
Those that know far more about this have just whispered in my ear that where it is an LTP amendment, which it is in this case because they're strategic assets, where it is an LTP amendment, yes, there will be the one proposal that you're putting out there for consultation.
Just on your recommendation, what is the CCO's feedback on that recommendation? Since you've formed it, brought it to us, no doubt you've taken it back to them.
The CCO's feedback is that essentially this is a decision for the shareholder that as was discussed at the workshop a couple of weeks ago, their preference is to retain ownership in the working waterfront assets, but at staff level they understand that to maintain the widest possible discretion through the consultation process and decision making, that consultation on the full transfer makes sense.
Anybody analysed maybe the possible reverse taxation benefits, considering, say, Wynyard has got high levels of contamination? Has anybody looked at the reverse of what you're concerned about? I mean, it's very easy to get fixated on the taxation risk one way, but we've got land assets there that require significant remediation, significant investment. Has anybody looked at the tax benefits possibly by retention? But I think I'm just thinking of Wynyard, for example, which has got, you know, layers of contamination.
Just through the chair, when we do the whole process of determining the valuation seeks to try and take into account those costs. Those costs would be taken into account no matter where you do that, but you can't just write off those costs, whether they were in Panuku and that, or whether they were in council, would have no tax implication for us, because if they're in council, there's no tax on those properties anyway. If they're there, they would deduct them, but it still leaves you at the same point where we're now. So it's only because, if you recall, the issue that we've had is we said that if we believe that the assets would normally come to council, and we tend to manage those assets in the council entity rather in the parent, rather than in the CCO, particularly Panuku, which is a development agency. So it's just about the fact that it's about transferring those over now rather than later. There's no tax difference from our perspective one way or the other around the contamination, because that's already has to be taken into account in valuing the assets. But there will be costs, and it all depends on the amount of remediation, depends on what you eventually do with each of the assets as well.
Well, Chair. So just, I'm very aware of, you know, the foundations of Panuku, and that was Waterfront Auckland, and the vision was to have a great waterfront urban park, and it was hard and soft, and it stretched from the west to the east. So are you confident that our vision for that will be not at risk?
Through the chair, look, hopefully I've been very clear in the workshops that we've had on this matter that if there is to be a transfer of the assets from Panuku back to council, at the same time there must be the appropriate delegations given to Panuku to allow them to continue on in their work uninterrupted, in the same way that in every other part of the region where Panuku operates on your behalf. The Manukau transform area is a good example, is that when you sign off a high level project plan for a transform location, at the same time you also give to Panuku the delegations to allow them to make that happen. Now, any transfer of these waterfront assets, in my view, should also be contingent on back-to-back delegations being given to Panuku so that they can continue, and things like the Headland Park aren't put in jeopardy.
Okay, and that's, you've referred to that in paragraph 10, second last sentence, I think, on paragraph 10. And so that will be reflected in the consultation document as well? It will be, thank you. And lastly, no doubt for taxation reasons, you've scanned other CCOs, and I'm thinking of Auckland Transport with a number of land assets that don't function as core transport assets. Have you looked at Auckland Transport's assets and the possibility of transferring those assets just as you've identified these Panuku assets?
Through you, Chair. In Auckland Transport's case, It's slightly different. Auckland Transport is a roading authority. They are non-taxable. So that's the first thing. But in addition to that, because of the legislation under which they operate, council retains legal ownership of the land anyway. Although it sits on their balance sheets, it's just an accounting issue. But legally, that is, the assets are owned by Auckland Council.
Thanks, Francis. Just on that, I had a question with regard to Panuku's role with regard to the working waterfront properties. So you're saying that they stay in Panuku's ownership, or they don't? I can't understand that. There's 2 paragraphs in here that say they will retain legal ownership because of their management role, and yet you've just said actually no, it's been transferred to us. So who is the owner under this arrangement?
At present, as of today, legal ownership of all the assets down Wynyard is with Panuku. The proposal that we've put in front of you is to transfer all of those assets back to council, including the working waterfront assets. There is another option available to you, as discussed in the workshops. Panuku's preference would be to retain ownership of the working waterfront assets, and you could decide to put out a consultation document which consults on the proposal being to transfer back to council all of the assets except the working waterfront assets. That's the choice that you have as a committee.
And you're not putting that in the consultation document, or you are? That's the other discussion we just had.
2 consultation documents have been prepared, and those were the ones that were at the workshop last week. One of them is premised on the transfer of all of the assets back. The second document is premised on transferring the development assets back and leaving the working waterfront assets in Panuku. Both documents show all the other options being status quo and transferring all the assets.
So if council makes a decision today on one option, you're going out to consult on more than one option?
If whatever the decision you make today, the consultation document will go out, and it must show the different options that were considered and the advantages and disadvantages, and each will have a preferred option. You've got 2 documents that you can choose from. One, which we have recommended, is the preferred option is to transfer all of the assets to council.
Second question, sorry.
Can I just, through the chair, I am sensing a little bit of confusion. So I'll have a go. Yeah, others. So I do think it's important we clarify if there is any confusion. Alistair, you're referring to one of the options being to transfer all of the assets. I want to make it clear, if that is the consultation document that you vote for, that consultation document also enables a conversation with Aucklanders and a subsequent decision that does not transfer all of the assets, but either transfers none of the assets or a component subset of the assets. I apologise a little bit for some of the confusion. This hasn't been easy for staff, and I think it arises because what we have needed to prepare in the background and make available to you today is 2 sets of documentation. Both enable you to have a substantive discussion with Aucklanders in the appropriate way. One of them is simply that you're able to have a bigger discussion that would enable a subsequent decision that all of the assets transfer. So we've listened to you at workshops, and I think we got a sense that there was good support to keep that option alive, and indeed to potentially recommend that that's what you go with. But to be clear, you have a choice today to not consult on anything, and we won't amend the LTP, or to consult on a narrower, I don't know that I want to use the word option again, a narrower package of assets and options. That's what we've understood the substantive debate you wanted to have today was about. I appreciate it's a bit confusing because that's not that easy to even say, but that's what we brought to you today. You know, and you can vote to, look, we're not that keen on the LTP amendment and we won't amend the LTP and we won't consult at all, or you could agree to consult in a way that lets you get the feedback from Aucklanders and make subsequent decisions that are all the way from transferring all of the Panuku assets down to only transferring some. Or, and we heard a little bit of this, you could reduce the package that you consult on so that the substantive working waterfront assets are simply retained as status quo, and that is not an option that you're talking to Aucklanders about. And that's what you've got on the table today.
Just another couple of questions, Alison. The documents that you gave us at the workshops, we had some comments and amendments to them. Are we getting a new set? If so, when? Because it's quite important that we kind of link what the decision is with what we're saying about it.
Next item.
Next item.
Yes, apparently in the next item, the consultation documents that follows on from your decision in this item will be handed out. So if you decide on the consult on the full transfer of the full assets, then that consultation document will be up for consideration in the next item.
Okay. One of my concerns...
Councillor Casey, what that means is we've got 2 sets of documents ready to go for the next item, and you'll get presented and handed out the one that is most appropriate, depending on the decision made here.
I just want to reiterate one of my concerns about this whole debate is that this is $800 million worth of strategic assets, and we have yet to see a list of all the properties that are in the package, and that's not going out to the public, and that is a concern to me.
In the supporting information to the consultation document is the addresses and legal descriptions of all the properties.
It wasn't in the one that went to the workshop then? It was said it was in another document.
In the supporting documentation.
I look forward to seeing it. Thank you.
Councillor Walker.
Question first up that goes to this point just raised, and that's around what we're consulting on, and you're suggesting that you've got a couple of options. Have we got those consultation options available to us now, or is that next step?
The actual documents.
Yeah, have I seen them?
You saw them at the workshop, and following the workshop, some amendments have been made, and they will be in the next item. I'm not sure if they went over the agenda or not.
So somebody's been at the workshop, has seen something, but we don't actually have it right now. Is that correct?
They're in the next item, and the summary of the consultation documents is contained in this report, but
we haven't seen it.
There's
It's
nothing,
going to be tabled.
Councillor, there's nothing sinister here. I mean, it's just...
No, I'm just trying to get a handle on whether I've got everything that I need to see, and I'm just establishing that there's some stuff that we're going to get later, depending on what this first level decision is.
yes, and
Okay, so
it's not hugely different as well, actually, I won't say how different it is.
There's not a lot of difference between the documents.
okay, so I've just got a few questions. First of all, just a background question. As far as other parts of council, and I'm referring to other CCOs, the assets lie with council. That's certainly the case with RFA. It's a trust mechanism. Auckland Transport, ATEED, Watercare, limited company. Is that a little different?
If we go
The
through-
assets still with council.
Auckland Transport, largely the assets are in council ownership. Transport has management and control. ATEED effectively doesn't have any assets. Regional Facilities Auckland, their assets are owned in a charitable trust, of which they are the trustee. Who have we got left? Panuku, the vast bulk of, as we've discussed, of what they operated on is council, and water care. The legislation there, I think they are in water care ownership, but I think that is because they are the Auckland Water Authority, and that's a decision of council. So those assets, I think, would vest in whoever council deemed to be the water authority.
Sure. So I guess at this point I'm a little bit unsure whether to ask this question now or whether I ask it later. That's useful context for Aucklanders to know around the options and the consideration here. So should I be asking that now or later? Later. Okay, so I'll ask that later. The other issue I've got is around the information that we're disclosing, particularly around advantages and disadvantages. Is it appropriate for me to ask that question now, or is that later? Okay, so around advantages and disadvantages, in the workshop, I certainly raised a number of concerns. One is, for example, if we're going forward, that an entity such as Panuku might not exist in the future. I don't know whether we've done a value for money review of Panuku. So I just put that on the table. Just because we've got an entity, it might be RFA, it might be Panuku, it might be some other CCO, does not mean necessarily that it's going to be fit for purpose into the future. So that's a test that I'm applying, and I think that that is useful information for Aucklanders to know. I'd certainly invite some response for that. I don't need that now. There are other issues moving into the future that go to the advantages around ownership, and particularly where we've got low-lying assets and we don't have a climate change adaptation strategy. We do know that we're going to be faced with very significant costs around the port area and this area, and I do not know what tests have been applied to that, but I think that's a very substantive issue. So I put that on the table. Another related issue goes to the stakeholders at Westhaven, and I'm particularly referring to the berth holders, who we have a contractual arrangement with. They're a long-standing stakeholder, and the berth holders, I understand, have put options to us. For example, one option that they would have is that they would take over the asset, perhaps in terms of the operation or the like. And I do not know whether those options are on the table, certainly as it goes to the operation of the asset and possibly the ownership of the asset. And I certainly know, Alistair, that one of the
Councillor, maybe
tests you apply is form, follow, and function.
Stretching a little bit. I mean, we've made it quite clear to the berth holders, they're not going to get the ownership of Westhaven. It's simple as that. It's going to stay with council or with Panuku. We've made that quite clear. That is not an issue we're really debating today.
Through you, Mr. Chair, this is a matter around consultation, around options. There's a process here that needs to be diligent, and I'm suggesting that options need to be on the table, irrespective of whether it's something that is an opinion that you might have or even council might have. So
well, we could put up.
I'm asking that.
Be interesting
I'm asking
thing
that
to
question.
consult on the sale of Westhaven as well. That would be.
So just a related question: have we done a value for money review of Panuku at all?
Mr. Chair, can I just ask the relevance?
Councillor Walker exhausted himself. I don't know.
I'm not exhausting myself. It's a pretty simple question. Yes or no?
I think the value for money from Panuku is the fact that we've approved their Transform and Unlock work program, and we've given them a budget and we've given them a way forward for about 5 years. I think that is really the essential business case that we've conducted on Panuku, and I don't think we're going to start doing something between now and whatever, Councillor Walker.
Okay, with respect, Mr. Chair, I asked a simple question. It only requires a yes or no answer. Have we done a value for money review of Panuku?
If you're referring to the Section 17A value for money program, Panuku has not been reviewed under that program as yet.
Okay.
Should I deal with the other.
I had some questions and I had hoped that Alistair might respond.
Very, very quickly, I think the first point you raised was around potential disestablishment of Panuku and by a future council. I guess that's at the heart of some of the advantages that we've listed under the options, mitigating some potential future liabilities of council. If at some stage in the future council decided to wind up Panuku, one of the considerations you'd have to take into account would be the potential tax liabilities of transferring those assets back to council. The same problem would exist. In regards to climate change, with respect, I think those issues face the low-lying lands of Wynyard Point, irrespective of who owns it. And it's a slightly different issue as to what council's response is going to be as opposed to who will actually own it. But ultimately, council, if work is needed to be done to respond to those challenges, then the council will be funding it, whatever happens. There have been some changes made to the consultation document reflecting concerns about climate change. So something has been inserted into the document in that regard around the need to strategies relating to the mitigation of the effects of climate change. In regard to Westhaven, I think just picking up on the chair's comments, we're expressly excluding transferring ownership of these assets outside of the group. We're only talking about the transfer of ownership within the council group, nothing outside of that. If the Westhaven berth holders have got some other views I'd like to put to it, well, that's the opportunity the consultation allows them.
Much, Mr. Chair, and I just make the observation that my questions were much less exhaustive than those of Councillor Darby, but
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's not working too well, is it? Is that right? I'll bring it back closer.
Just speak through it. It kind of supposed to self-write itself.
Okay.
I've been told.
All right. Okay. Very good. Self-writing. Very good, Councillor. My question's around we refer to no cost in the document, and in paragraph 5 it says transferring waterfront assets from council-controlled organisation to the council entity for no cost will be considered a taxable income. So just a couple of things for clarification, just so I'm clear what we're doing. That reads to me that if we moved those assets across for cost, then you don't have the tax bill associated with it. So why are we not looking at that as an option? Is there a reason around that? I guess the other thing I'm wondering there, because I wondered if that could be advantage to us in terms of our balance sheet increasing. So, yeah, I guess that's the question, really. Yeah, thank you.
Through you, Chair. Right itself? I don't know. Let's try and see. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, no. The IRD listening now. We have considered whether we actually transfer them for full value. What that really means is it's just a really rigmarole. We pay the cash through to them. They then have to declare a dividend so we can get the money back to us, because we don't want them to sit and hold cash while we borrow. Okay. And as soon as they want to pay that back to us, that's the whole purpose of this legislative change, is that then becomes a taxable dividend. So that it's taxable either way. There's no difference. It's just that we don't want to write out a check to them and then have them write out a check back to us. So we just, by doing it for no charge, they just deem a dividend so it's just a mechanics. But effectively, we're paying for it and we're getting a dividend back. but we don't do that because of the cost of actually moving the cash around. Okay, but it is the same effect, but the tax implications are exactly the same. I trust that answers your question.
Thank you. Actually, that's sort of clarified some of the things that I was wanting to ask. But one of the things that I just, and I did mention this at the workshop that we had, and it is public. It was on. There's a public website, www.interest.co.nz, and I was really surprised that none of us have been told about what is actually happening down in the Wynyard Quarter. That there's been I'll just have a, sorry. So there's actually been a toxic waste problem down there, and I'm just really concerned that with Panuku, they've actually got ATIDs in one of the buildings at the moment there, and there's a lot of contamination down there. So I'm just really concerned that what implication that's going to have with Panuku and with the Auckland Council for what we're trying to achieve here. Thank you.
Look, I will go into. I think it's not directly relevant to the question of who should own those assets, because ultimately the cost of remediation is going to be borne by the council. But I think it is worth noting that remediation down Wynyard is a significant issue and a significant challenge for Wynyard. I mean, a bit of background, the reclamation was done from soil from an old gasworks site, so it came complete with cyanide and arsenic and other nasties from that site, and then we put some petrochemical tanks on top of it, and they've leaked for years. So it's not a pleasant environment down there. So one of the challenges for Panuku, which they would have whether they own the land or we own the land, is when they're dealing with developers or anyone who wants to build on that land, or if they want to develop some public open space or parkland down there, is getting that land into a suitable condition so that it meets all the appropriate standards and the development can proceed. Where the risk for remediation lies is a commercial matter between Panuku and potential developers, and it's just an ongoing challenge. So I think it's good to be aware of it, and it is expensive, and it is it is a challenge that will be there until the whole point has been redeveloped.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Francis, probably you might be best to answer this. The past 2 days, there's been 2 conference phone calls had between council, myself as Deputy Mayor, Deputy Chair of Audit and Risk, with the independent directors of the Audit and Risk Committee. That was on Monday. And yesterday, we had the same call, but with the officers of the Auditor General. And someone needs to relate the outcomes of those conversations back to this group here now, to give the confirmation that they are both satisfied with the process and the proposed outcomes.
No. I just want to get the actual document so that I can just read it. So what will come through when we actually go to the governing body to actually adopt it is that the Deputy Auditor General will address the council. What I can confirm, irrespective of which option you take, okay, whichever option you take, we can confirm that the Deputy Chair and the Chair of Audit and Risk have been able to confirm to His Worship the Mayor that they've received a report on the controls and risks relating to the potential long-term plan amendment consultation document. They can advise the governing body that effective controls and risk management processes have been followed in the preparation of the consultation document and supporting information, and that the chair had delegated authority to discuss the matter with the chair, and the deputy chair had of audit and risk had delegated authority to discuss the matter with Audit New Zealand and then to advise the governing body once Audit New Zealand confirmed that they have completed their audit and that there are no outstanding issues. They subsequently had those discussions that the Deputy Mayor has referred to, and Audit New Zealand have indicated that they intend to issue a clean audit report on receipt of the approved consultation document, whichever one you've chosen and it's approved, and the underlying supporting information and a signed letter of representation, which will be signed by the Mayor. And they can advise that the governing body that there are no outstanding audit issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. Thank you for your presentation. I'm just thinking of people who don't own marinas or boat parking or whatever you call it at the marina, or have anything to do with the waterfront. If they know about this consultation or want to know about it, wouldn't they think, oh, that's a $220 million potential cost to council. Why are you even going to the public for this? So could you, you know, it's just part of our job as good stewards of money to do it ourselves, make that decision ourselves. But anyway, could you clarify that we have to go out for public consultation on this? It's a statutory requirement?
Yes, look, to be blunt, the only reason we are consulting on this is because the assets in question are listed as strategic assets, and the Local Government Act requires us to go out to do these transfers, requires an amendment to the LTP, and we were required to do a special consultative procedure.
Thank you. We will be in a few weeks' time at Have Your Say meetings and so on, trying to explain what this means. And I'm not entirely sure what it does mean yet. So could you just clarify for us what is actually meant by capital letters council entity?
Council, and I think that wording, did that come from audit?
No, that was from
us. So it's to distinguish between the council and the council group and the CCOs.
Like department, as it were. A special land holding department, or how does that work?
No, it would just mean that the legal owner would be Auckland Council. And yeah.
And so, leaving aside the question of the difference between 100% ownership by Auckland Council of Panuku and its asset portfolio and the council entity, I'll move on to the next question. But that's going to be not that easy to explain to people, to be honest. Okay. The Panuku board, there's one sentence in the report, section 22, that indicates the Panuku board apparently is not supportive of this. Could the members of the governing body or members of this committee be given the correspondence from the Panuku board? Presumably there's a letter, presumably there are resolutions, and presumably there is an explanation why Panuku do not think this is a good idea.
When this issue first came up last year. This committee asked staff to go away and work with Panuku on this issue. There is no correspondence and there is no formal resolution. What there was a series of discussions at a staff level. I attended a Panuku board meeting, and as an act of good faith, we gave the Panuku board the opportunity to come and speak with you directly, which they did at a workshop 2 weeks ago, where Adrian Young Cooper, the chair of the board, as well as Richard Leggett, another one of the directors, and Roger McDonald, the chief executive, were there and discussed this issue and outlined their reasons as to why they thought they should retain ownership of the working waterfront assets. So there's no formal correspondence, but that view was communicated in the workshop with this committee.
Just confirm, there's the issue of the transfer of $800 million worth of assets from Panuku, and Panuku has no written views, no resolution, no correspondence, nothing whatsoever in response to the council's proposal. Is that correct?
That is correct, and perhaps it goes slightly to Councillor Bartley's question that this might be sort of being blown up into a slightly bigger deal than what it really is by the need to do a special consultative procedure because it's an amendment to the LTP. In the normal course of events, this wouldn't, it's not significant in the sense that we're just transferring legal ownership within the assets. Effective management and control would not change under what we're proposing.
Has the council formally written to the board of Panuku outlining this proposal?
Yes, we wrote a board paper that went to the Panuku board, which I attended, as well as copies of the reports that went to this committee last year. I think October and November there were, or November and December, there were a couple of reports that came to this committee, which they've been provided to Panuku as well.
I just want to confirm, this is quite important. So the council has written to Panuku, presumably the chair, and the chair or the chief executive has not responded.
I wouldn't say that they haven't responded. At a staff level, we've been having what seems like a never-ending series of meetings discussing this and how it would work. Like I said before, we've had direct engagement between the Panuku board and this committee at a workshop. Look, I'm not entirely sure.
Nothing in writing, which is quite extraordinary. Just moving on, sorry, Mr. Chairman, in regard to the $800 million worth of land assets, which I suggest, given the Auckland property prices, may be a bit conservative, but especially on the waterfront. However, are you saying that to transfer those assets after July, though I have never seen any plans or anything in writing to suggest that the council intended that land would be transferred out of Panuku, it would cost the $800 million worth of assets, according to the new law, would cost the council $220 million in tax to merely change from 100% ownership of the CCO that owns the asset to the council entity. Is that correct?
That's exactly, well, that's an estimate. So what would happen is if that transfer happened after 1 July, and it was for other than fair value, council would be liable to pay tax in 28 cents in the dollar of the assessed fair value of those properties. Now, they're on our books at the moment for $800 million or thereabouts. So the estimate of the tax bill at with what we know today would be $220 million, yes. Because the IRD would deem that to be a dividend.
Okay, and this would be similar to something which is not actually owned by the council, but that doesn't make sense. That'll be hard to explain to the public. Just one more thing. I want to emphasise my deep concern at the lack of anything in writing from Panuku, apart from this hearsay statement, that they oppose it. And I would ask for any report or any board paper or any information from Panuku and from the council to Panuku be provided to the elected members of the governing body of this committee. Thank you. Is that agreeable?
The only thing that we can add to that, which I'm happy to share with the committee, is a paper that we wrote to the Panuku board. And again, I'll just emphasise that it hasn't been done in a vacuum. We had the chair of Panuku sitting in front of you and discussing this issue.
It's a very strange way to go about transferring $800 million worth of assets. Nothing in writing. Nothing in writing. Have you ever heard of that?
My question is based on a question that the Deputy Mayor asked, and that's in regards to the audit and risk that he mentioned, the committee. Can you tell me who are the 3 private members of that particular committee, and in your opinion, they have business acumen that has the ability to make the decision that they have, please?
Do you know that?
So they were appointed by council based on their business acumen and their knowledge. That's why they were appointed. The chair is Sue Sheldon, who's a respected independent director, and then there is Mr. Bruce Robinson, who is an ex-assistant auditor general of the Office of the Auditor General, and the third person is Mr. Paul Kondo, who is again a respected and independent member of a number of organisations, audit and risk committees. So they were appointed by council because of that. They went through a due process.
Mr. Chair, my frustration is, and my question is, why are we having this lengthy debate about something that is simply our fiduciary duty? It's our job as stewards of our exceedingly large budget to look at the opportunity to save ratepayers of Auckland $200 million. For me, it's quite an open and shut case or more. So am I correct in thinking that the transfer of these parcels of land happen as normal council business? A development is completed, a park is completed, it transfers back to council. This is the normal movement between council and Panuku on a daily basis. The only change that we're being alerted to here is the fact that Wellington have changed the law to allow them to reach into the ratepayers' pockets of Auckland and whip away $200 million and pop it in the back pocket of government to spend on other stuff. And, you know, I'm sitting here as a councillor for Auckland saying, I think we've got a lot of reason to actually hold on to that $200 million because we've got some very big bills to pay. So the discussion here, and this is my question, simply sits with our responsibility to manage carefully and sensibly the liability for a $200+ million tax bill. Am I correct? Thank you.
We are just trying to be sensible and prudent.
The answer is yes.
Mayor Goff, and I believe you've got comments.
Yeah, I think the questions have all been answered, and I listened carefully to what Councillor Hulse just said and Councillor Bartley before that. And I just come to the conclusion it's a no-brainer. We have a responsibility to protect the value of the assets held by the people of Auckland. And I think Councillor Walker summed it up quite well too. What if we decide that Panuku is no longer fit for purpose and we disband the organisation? Suddenly, to make that decision, which, you know, it's a subsidiary organisation, ownership by a subsidiary actually belongs to the parent. But if we made that decision, we would be up for over $200 million, which would be a transfer of ratepayer money from Auckland to the Consolidated Fund in Wellington. And I can't understand why anybody thinks that that is a good idea. And I frankly struggle to believe that when the whole emphasis of our debate is how we should be devolving funding from central government to local government, this actually takes the opposite view. That if we were to transfer that asset within the family group, we would be making a donation of over $200 million to central government. And we have a responsibility to Aucklanders to not make that gift for no good reason to central government. I support the resolution, and I support the resolution because when I've looked at the detail of it, I think Aucklanders ought to have the choice between full transfer, partial transfer, or no transfer. And the way that we give them the choice under our processes is to put the maximum transfer up, and then we can come back from that if that is the signal given to us by Auckland ratepayers. But, you know, I've got the document that everybody else got. It's not saying there is only one option, it's saying there are three options, effectively. The proposal of full transfer, the status quo, or the partial transfer, and it's got the arguments for and against each. So our obligation to Aucklanders is during this consultation process, we give them all of the information and they come back to us and tell us what they think about it. I read a headline in Newsroom the other day that we were indulging in tax avoidance and that somehow this was improper. I just think that that is a nonsense. Right now, before the new law comes into effect, that transfer would take place and there is no tax liability. And why should there be a tax liability when it's between the subsidiary and the parent? The ownership, everybody understands, is Auckland's, but it's held legally with Panuku. But somehow, if we transfer the legal ownership, it creates a liability. And I don't think we should be up for that liability. I want to just make the two last points. One is the change of ownership, and I'm actually open-minded on whether the working assets of the waterfront go to the council body or to stay with Panuku. But either way, the liability for management remains with Panuku. So for the clientele of Westhaven, they won't notice any difference. The paper ownership will be with council if we make that decision, but the management will be with Panuku. Nothing will change for them. And I think it's important to make that point. And the last point is just to accentuate that this is not about doing anything improper. The Audit and Risk Committee and its private members have said we have followed the right process, but we have also gone one step further and we've sought a binding ruling from Inland Revenue to determine that this process is quite proper. No subterfuge here, no deceit, no hidden agendas. We've sought that ruling. And if the ruling is, no, it's not proper, and you will be liable for the tax, then the same ownership structure would prevail with all of the constraints that creates for us if we decided at some point in the future to change the shape and form of Panuku. So I want to thank officials for what I think is really good work on sorting through the options, and I think this resolution does produce the best result for Aucklanders and for ratepayers.
Thank you, Mayor. And you mentioned the independent members of the Audit Committee, but remember Audit New Zealand is an agent for the Auditor General, and I believe you heard from Francis, Audit New Zealand is happy with this, which therefore indicates Audit New Zealand is also happy. I have Councillor Simpson, Watson and Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I am speaking in support of the recommendation. It's a financial resolution, set of resolutions that benefit Auckland ratepayers. It's not binding, it's going out for consultation. But by agreeing to A, we have the most flexibility. I think, Francis, you hit the nail on the head when you said we are acting in the most prudent financial way that benefits the ratepayers of Auckland. We have a council parent and we have the council group. This is literally just shifting from one part of council to another for a legal ownership that actually saves us some money. It doesn't sell anything, it doesn't change how it operates. In fact, it's almost business as usual, as opposed, it's just the legal entity. Why wouldn't we do the best by ratepayers by just shifting illegal ownership? I suppose if I put it in layman's terms, Mr. Chairman, potentially it's like putting a property in a family trust instead of in personal ownership, potentially, for some of the advantages or disadvantages. It's kind of like that. So I want to congratulate the staff by front-footing this. The legislation changed and they are immediately aware of the financial implications for this council and for ratepayers. They've come up with some options, and all we're doing, and we have to do it, is consult. We're not making the final decision, all right? I think what councillors need, through you, Mr. Chair, is a series of bullet points to speak to the consultation document, because I'm getting the distinct impression that people, even though we've had discussions around this in a workshop, are still unclear as to some of the issues. So if you are going to take it, I mean, it's a legal process, you have to go out for consultation. I think we need to, and we'll come to this maybe in the next item, but we just need 2 or 3 bullet point statements to stop incorrect media or chat around what we're doing. It is not illegal, it's not dodgy, it's prudent financial practice, trying to save the ratepayers some money, keeping the ownership within the council. We are the council group. We're just the council parent part of the council group. And I think at the end of the day, once people really understand that clearly, they'll see the benefit of it. So I speak in support of it, and I hope my colleagues will vote accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The recommendation goes to consulting on the full transfer of waterfront assets owned by Panuku to the council entity. So I just like to make a couple of brief comments on the general context in which we're going out here. And I would say the use of the term the council entity is not helpful, because that does have suggestions that it's perhaps some other part of council or something that's been formed. So I've made that point before, and I won't labour on it. And there's certainly a great deal of public sensitivity, if we're talking about consultation, to do with council assets and their disposal or their transfer, and waterfront assets in particular. And I think we should bear that in mind. And if we're going to be honest, in particular the role that Panuku has played on that during this term of council, certainly in my ward, if we're talking of reception of this consultation material, there's a great deal of distrust in terms of the way council has dealt with its assets. In very quick measure, we've lost our council officers. We've had our 2 main marinas up for sale, one in particular in entirely questionable circumstances, and I would suggest that it's not just that ward. Westhaven in particular has a similar sentiment in terms of ownership and the role of Panuku. So I think, if anything, the recommendation here will be warmly received by the public, and certainly the people out at Westhaven. And it's really reflected in basically the lack of trust. And that's the context we're going out in. Our latest citizens monitoring trust in council decision making is going down. It's at 20%. So people like Councillor Lee that question are quite right, because that's a context, that's the feeling amongst significant sections of Auckland in terms of anything to do with assets, and that goes to what has actually happened. So it's not fanciful, it's based on real events and real disposals. So I thank the officers. I think your explanations has been fairly clear, and notwithstanding some dramatic revelation, which always take that as a fallback position, I think there's a degree of compulsion to the case that's been put up. But I would just again signal, Mr. Chair, that assets and what has happened in this council, and waterfront assets in particular, are sensitive and will require perhaps a clearer explanation than has been the case thus far, to explain what is happening and to reassure that that there's not some Machiavellian scheme behind this, because people, unfortunately, have a degree of justification in feeling that when it comes to our role in assets during this term of council.
Thank you, Councillor, and by voting for this, it will ensure that you do get the chance to have a good discussion after the consultation feedback before we make a move, rather than not having a discussion. So, Councillor Lee, to wrap it up.
Yeah, just another question. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I see that transferring these assets to avoid tax is going to cost us $300,000 to $500,000. Is that correct?
Councillor, I just really would appreciate if you don't use the word avoid. It's not in the report at all. So we'll just note that that's your personal opinion.
I think it is in the report. The whole purpose of this, I understand, is to transfer these assets to avoid having to pay tax, which will change on the 1st of July. Am I missing something here?
I think
avoid tax.
The point of this is that, and I think this is the issue to consider, if you are going to transfer these assets to council ownership at some time in the future, if you do it now, you give yourselves the most financial flexibility to do that. If you do it after 1 July, you will have to consider the potential tax implications of any movement of those assets within the group, and that could be significant impact on rates and debt.
My question is, what is the $300,000 to $500,000 for to transfer these assets? Where will that cost go? Who will get that?
There will be costs associated with the tax people that we're working with to ensure that we are doing this by the book. There will also be legal costs and due diligence costs around that. There's a number of agreements and obligations with all of the parcels and the water space assets down in Wynyard, and there will be quite a deal of legal work that will have to go on to make sure that the appropriate contracts are novated to council and the appropriate due diligence is done.
So, I mean, that's disappointing. We're up for $500,000 probably, when there seems to be no attempt at all to engage with the government to say this is ridiculous. If it is 28 cents in the dollar for 100% council-owned assets to move from one part of the council to the other, not that we've ever planned on doing this before, but apparently we are thinking about it now. Why couldn't that part of the act, that part of the legislation, be changed? That's what councils normally do when legislation deliberately or accidentally negatively impacts on their ratepayers. So why haven't we done that?
Through you, Chair. Through you, Chair. When this legislation went before Parliament, we did go down to the Select Committee. We made representations to that Select Committee. We requested that they do not make those changes, they decided not to take our advice and they proceeded with the changes.
Again, this is one of the, when we're talking about $200 million, with all due respect, this is what the meetings between the Cabinet and the Auckland Council governing body were meant to address. And we had those every year on a regular basis up until the advent of the current mayor. And this is just another reason that why we at governing body level need to talk to the government, not, with all due respect, officer to official level. I've got nothing to say, Mr. Chairman, on this because I still have a whole lot of unanswered questions.
Councillor Cooper, you've got something to say?
Even if we have to spend a few $100,000 to avoid spending $220 million, that's actually good value. And my take on it is this, that at the moment we're not liable for that tax because it doesn't exist in law until July. So we're not avoiding, we're just not liable. If we do this now, we're just doing what we could do at any time before July the 1st. If we'd done it last year, any time. If we tried to do this and didn't pay the tax after July the 1st, then we'd be tax avoiding. So as far as I'm concerned, I feel very comfortable that we're completely within the law and we're doing what anybody would do in any household. Everybody says, you know, balance your books just like a household has to. If you had some sort of liability that you could avoid if you changed your situation before the law came into effect, anybody would do that if they were smart. And that's what we're doing. We're being smart to save $220 million for the ratepayers. If we had to borrow that to pay tax, we'd be probably just about breaching our borrowing limits. And so I do support this. You know, it's got nothing to do at the moment whether Panuku is perceived as good or bad. It's got nothing to do with it. This is about us making sure we don't spend $220 million that would be better spent somewhere else.
So I'm going to put the motion. We have a mover and a second. All those in favour, say aye. Aye. Against? Recorded? Okay, Councillor Lee is to be recorded. Thank you. We'll have a 5-minute break and we'll hand out the relevant consultation document now that we've decided that, and people can have a little squiz before we move to item number 8. Thank you.